Chapter 25 in our California Studies class deals with the Great Depression. The loosely regulated U.S. economy in the 1920s was built too heavily on income from profits rather than in wages. That almost sounds like what's going on today. Sorry, don't mean to editorialize, but seems like wages are shrinking and the fat cats are getting fatter. Anyway, ultimately what happened was millions of speculators bid up the price of corporate stocks that were unsustainable, those prices were, and bore little resemblance to their true value. The stock market eventually crashed, happened in October of 1929, and that market crash spread from Wall Street in New York to Montgomery Street in San Francisco, which was San Francisco's financial district, to many main streets across America, and there was a lot of pain, By 1934, 20% of California's population was on relief, and of course we all know about the Dust Bowl and how about a third of the people who were farmers in that area of the United States who no longer could farm because of weather and soil conditions, lost mortgages on their homes and farms, and about a third of them actually came out to California to seek a better life, and they didn't necessarily find a better life when they got here. In the 1930s, California's government was ineffectual with respect to remedies, trying to help people during the Depression during this time. Republican James Rolfe, who was the former mayor of San Francisco, we mentioned him before, was elected governor of California in 1930. Though he was a popular mayor in San Francisco, he was ineffective in dealing with the Depression in California. He signed a legislature-approved state sales tax, but vetoed an income tax bill. Food was taxed, so the burden mostly fell disproportionately on the poor. People with little markets, when people would go in to buy food, they would say, well, you better pay another penny for Jimmy. That was the expression, according to the authors of your book. It gets more bizarre from here, because in order for Sonny Jim Rolfe to try to regain a certain amount of popularity so that he would get reelected in 1934, he openly abetted and defended a lynching. Lynchings were alarmingly common by vigilante groups in California at this time. Two men were being held for a kidnapping in the Santa Clara County Jail in November of 1933. A mob broke into the jail, took the prisoners, the suspects, and hanged them publicly in St. James Park in downtown San Jose. Rolfe actually encouraged this. Rolfe died during his campaign for re-election in the summer of 1934. Then Lieutenant Governor Frank Merriam, who was a Long Beach real estate agent, became the governor and then was elected to the governor of California position in November of 1934. So Rolfe's successor, the lieutenant governor, actually got elected in his own right in 1934. A lot of people coming along at this particular time during the Depression, the 1920s and 1930s. You know, if you've ever watched that movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which is situated in the southern United States during the Depression, one of the lines that George Clooney's character says, everybody's looking for answers. So there was a certain amount of religious evangelism at this time. Sister Amy Semple McPherson was quite famous at this time in the 1920s and early 1930s. Preached the Four Square Gospel at her Angelus Temple and over her own radio station, KFSG Radio in Los Angeles. Her following did decline in the early 1930s in favor of more economic and political evangelism. There was a Dr. Francis Townsend who had something called the Townsend Plan, who proposed an old age pension of anybody over 50 years old that would get $200 a month from the government. The recipients were then, within that 30 days of getting that money, required to spend the money, which would then restore the proper circulation of money. This actually became a very powerful force in state politics and eventually national politics, the Townsend Plan. On the left is a picture of Sister Amy Semple McPherson, and above a picture of Dr. Francis Townsend. So there are some important people in California history during the Depression. Xenophobia and nativism resurged in California during this Depression time. I don't know if it ever really went away in the 19-teens and 1920s. It never certainly did, because of all the exclusions against, Japanese and Chinese and so on. People, of course, were looking to the immigrants as scapegoats for their economic ills. To a certain extent, that's actually happening today, unfortunately. In 1935, the U.S. Congress passed the Filipino Repatriation Act, which offered to pay the transportation expenses of any Filipino who wanted to return to their homeland. Those repatriated could not re-enter the U.S. Only 2,000 Filipinos were repatriated. It's important to understand and remember that any exclusion acts against Chinese and Japanese did not include the Southeast Asians known as Filipinos, because at this time the Philippine Islands were a possession of the United States. So technically, they would belong to the U.S. The federal government initiated a program of mass repatriation of more than 400,000 Spanish-speaking people to Mexico. Recent estimates suggest that 60% of them were actually U.S. citizens, but if you looked Mexican and spoke Spanish, they figured you were Mexican, not a U.S. citizen, and they rounded up and they sent you across the border. As many as 75,000 to 100,000 of them were forced out of California at this time. Labor strife is something to talk about during this time. Women took the lead in organizing cannery workers, since they were the ones who were mostly employed in the canneries. Remember that any kind of labor agreements before did not include people who worked in farm, ag workers, farm workers, cannery workers. The women were employed for under quite astounding conditions. 16 hours a day for a work day at the rate of only 15 cents an hour. The United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America formed. Most of them were women, and Latinas were amongst their leaders, including Union Vice President Luisa Morena in 1931. Then there was another group called the Cannery and Agricultural Workers Industrial Union, the CAWIU, which became active in 1933. It led a grape worker and cotton picker strike, separate strikes in the San Joaquin Valley in 1933, and a vegetable picker strike in the Imperial Valley in 1934. Up in the San Francisco Bay Area, unions that were weakened during the 1920s began to seek some strength, I should say, in provisions of what was called the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. Remember that by this time FDR was president. There were a lot of acts and organizations passed as a result of the New Deal, and one of those which was the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, gave clout to collective bargaining units who wanted to reform. The International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA, was weakened in 1919 by employers, but it rebounded in 1933 under the leadership of a fellow from Australia by the name of Harry Bridges, who was a longshoreman. He won almost all the workers away from the employer-controlled union. There was a lot of pro-worker sentiment in these days because there were a lot of people that were unemployed. The dock workers at all Pacific ports struck on May 9th, 1934. Employers tried to break that strike. On July 5th, 1934, San Francisco police tried to clear 5,000 pickets from the Embarcadero. This was known as Bloody Thursday. There was then a general strike over the entire Bay Area by July 16th, 1934. Not just of the longshoremen, but all other trade unions joined in. Harry Bridges, pictured here in the front there, was considered a communist by his foes. Bands of vigilantes, encouraged by Governor Merriam, broke into Communist Party offices in San Francisco and Oakland. After 4 days, this general strike was called off in the Bay Area. Ultimately, waterfront issues were settled by a way of a federal arbitration board, which ruled in favor of hiring halls, which were then largely controlled by the longshoremen's union. So the workers controlling their own hiring processes, this is a major victory for the longshoremen's union, without question. Then there was a fellow by the name of Upton Sinclair, who you probably heard about. He wrote a book called The Jungle, which had to do with the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the early 1900s. A little background: in 1932, President Herbert Hoover was running for re-election as a Republican. The Democrat was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He won election to the presidency in 1932, and Hoover lost. Not only did Hoover lose the election nationally of the presidency, but he actually lost California and his home county of Santa Clara. Hoover was from, San Jose. Potentially then any New Dealer could have won the gubernatorial race in California 2 years later, but you know what? That didn't happen. because this fellow came along by the name of Upton Sinclair. He was the socialist candidate for governor in 1926 and 1930, but he ran as the Democratic nominee against Merriam in 1934. Sinclair was well known as a pamphleteer and a propaganda novelist, especially for his novel The Jungle, which I mentioned a moment ago, concerning the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the early 1900s. He and his family moved to Pasadena in 1915. He was involved in a waterfront strike in 1923, and he actually founded the Southern California branch of the American Civil Liberties Union in that area at that time in the 1920s. When he ran for governor, he began his campaign by writing a utopian novel about his campaign called I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty, a True Story of the Future. That came out in 1933. And he started a program called End Poverty in California, called EPIC at this time. He received the Democratic nomination to run for governor from the Democrats in California without FDR's support. FDR was not a supporter of him. He ran against Republican Merriam, who was the incumbent. Republicans organized an elaborate media attack against Sinclair during the election. In 1935, then Merriam, of course, 1934, Merriam was elected. He signed another number of bills a year later that brought California into line with many of the national New Deal's policies. At this time, the most active Democrat in the California legislature was then State Senator Culbert L. Olson of Los Angeles. Olson managed to succeed in a popular repeal of the state sales tax from food items. He also succeeded in passing a modest state income tax and a slight increase in assistance to the indigent aged, I should say. The latter program, however, was not particularly effective because it really didn't help old people very much at all. Then there was a ham and eggs it was a slang name, the ham and eggs pension scheme, which was purported and promoted by a couple of brothers who owned an ad agency, Willis and Lawrence Allen. They actually stole the idea from their client, Robert Noble, who was a Los Angeles area radio commentator at the time. Noble's idea was that every Californian over the age of 50 would get a script for $25 every Monday. The Allen brothers stole the idea and changed it to $30 every Thursday. Merriam was against it in 1938. Olson avoided a clear stand on the issue, but Olson won the election of 1938. Even though the ham and eggs proposal lost at the ballot box, it got a significant number of yes votes. And here is one of the fake dollars issued by opponents of the ham and eggs pension plan in the LA Times in October of 1938, just prior to the gubernatorial election, in which the Democrat Olson won. And there you have a little bit about California politics during the Depression of the 1930s.